all of the avatars in the Indian tradition are said to be avatars of this principle of maintenance of Vishnu. It is said that they come specifically to keep things going, during some period when things might be more in danger of falling apart. They also come to show us what is possible for us embodied beings. Now, the avatars of Vishnu you might have heard of are Krishna and Ram. Jesus Christ is also considered an avatar in the Indian tradition. He's not, in the Christian tradition, he's not considered an avatar of Vishnu. But Indians consider Jesus Christ to be an avatar of Vishnu because they are more Catholic than Christian. That general, more bigger sense of the word Catholic, meaning having a big, generous view. So they don't mind, they're like, yeah, invite him into the party. In the Tibetan tradition, the only avatar that I know of is Padmasambhava, the second Buddha. And there might be other ones, I'm sure there are, but that's the only one I know of who kind of fits that description. So even the Shakyamuni Buddha, the first Buddha, was born in a relative state of ignorance and had to do a ton of spiritual practice, to get to the point that he got to. And he became very awake, but he wasn't born that way. So that's just a very enlightened person. So Anandamayi Ma is considered to be an avatar of Vishnu. And I was just starting to say that in addition to, some people saying that the avatars do course corrections, and there have also been animal avatars of Vishnu too. So not just in the human realm, and maybe there have been avatars in other realms of other beings that we can't see. But the other thing that I think is very important for the avatar phenomenon is that they show us what is possible in a human body. What can we accomplish? What does enlightenment look like? Because even though someone might be highly enlightened or highly awake, they're never really going to be fully awake, having gone through this process of being born into ignorance and then waking up. There's always going to be something lingering, in terms of ignorance. And that's certainly been my experience with every teacher I've had, and I've had some of the greatest teachers around. So, and also other teachers like Swami Lakshmanju, who's one of the inheritors of Kashmir Shaivism, has done some beautiful teachings on that we can be like Shiva, we can be like an enlightened being, but we can't be exactly that in our condition. We can get close, which is fine, because most of us are so unclose that close would be an incredible accomplishment. However, when we meet someone or have an experience of someone like Anandamayi Ma, we get to see what enlightenment really looks like full on. And we get to see what it looks like in a human body. This is very, very important. We don't have many examples of that. So this is, to me, the great value of the avatars. They really give us the benchmark. It's good to follow our regular teachers, and as I've said many, many times, the reason we can still wake up working with teachers who are only partially enlightened is because to whatever extent they are, that awakeness is pure. Right? So we can identify with that and work with that. But when we encounter in a deep way an avatar, it's almost like the lid gets blown off of any concept we had about what enlightenment looks like or what spirituality is or what we can do or not do. And I know from my own experience, because I had many teachers, maybe not as many as some people. I had a couple teachers I worked with very closely as an older person, and then a couple of people I worked with in my 20s. And one of the people I worked with was Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, considered one of the greatest teachers on the planet today. And when I started encountering Anandamayi Ma, it was like a whole different game, where there was just nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Every time I tried to make an excuse for myself or think I was getting away with something, or, I just had to take one look at her and I was like, okay, I'm not getting away with shit. To work, there's a wonderful book by, what is her name? Swami Radha. She was a student of Swami Sivananda, also another great guru. Sivananda of Rishikesh, you may have heard of him. He was actually my Parama Guru. So he was the guru of my Diksha Guru. He was the guru of Swami Satyananda Saraswati, the head of my Diksha lineage. And so this woman started having dreams about Swami Sivananda when she was in her late 40s, like 46 or 47, something like that. And she then started writing to him, and he encouraged her to come see him. And she went to India, and she was actually only with him for 6 months, but apparently they were like constant companions, and he just gave her a huge download and sent her back to Canada to teach. In any case, she opens this, she wrote a little autobiography, which is really sweet. I think we have it in our lending library if anyone wants to read it. She starts off by saying, having any teacher is wonderful, but having a Sat Guru, having that guru who's going to remove the ignorance or help you to remove ignorance in a thorough way, she says it's the greatest adventure one can possibly have in a human life. And that is certainly my experience with Ma, that it's like a no-holds-barred bungee jumping, jump out of a plane kind of experience. Most of us aren't really ready for that. We'll take something a little calmer. So I want to read you, this is a book. Some of you have heard this before, but it's always wonderful to hear it again. This is a book that was written down by one of Ma's principal male disciples, and it records private conversations he had with her. And in fact, some of these conversations took place under a banyan tree, which is a beautiful kind of tree in India, in a neighborhood of Hardwar called Kanka, where there's a Ma ashram. And Ma sat with him till late into the night and early morning hours and talked to him. And then he recorded what she said. And we actually went to that banyan tree and did some circumambulation in mantra. So this is her description of her birth. She was born in 1896 in a little town in what used to be Bengal, but is now Bangladesh. A little town, a rural area called Kaira, which was part Hindu and part Muslim. So she had a lot of Muslim neighbors and Hindu neighbors. Her parents were Vaishnavite Shaktas, so they were worshippers of Devi and following also of Lord Krishna. They were tantric practitioners, as were almost all the Indian people in Bengal at that time. So this is her description. In the early morning hours of a Friday, in the month of April-May, lunar month, inside a thatched room, this body revealed herself. So she referred to herself at times as this body, but you'll see that in these conversations, which are very familiar with this disciple, she occasionally also says I. Okay, so inside a thatched room, this body revealed herself, the head pointing toward the northeasterly direction. This is her birth. The body, as you perceive it, at the moment of touching the ground, lay on its back, slightly inclined to its left side. At that very moment, Kurima, her paternal aunt, picked her up. So Ma is talking about herself in the third person. She, the aunt, was the only one present in the room at that time. So what Ma is saying is that she wasn't born from a human mother, that she just appeared on the floor in a certain position, and then her maternal aunt or paternal aunt found her and picked her up. This is very typical of the story of the birth of the avatars. So usually there's a story about rising on a lake, out of a lake on a lotus, and a moon disk in the middle of the lotus. This is the story of Padmasambhava's birth. And there are many other stories of avatar births like this. But, you know, here we have, the Padmasambhava was born in the 8th century. Here we have a 20th century account of this birth from a person who was photographed and videoed and recorded. And, you know, it's really someone we can relate to in our time. It's quite extraordinary. So she, Kurima, was the only one present in the room at that time. No one else was there. She alone knows of the revelation of the Supreme One. Kurima was a very virtuous and devout woman and about 60 years of age at that time. She lived to be quite old and passed away after this body was married. So Ma was a householder. She was actually married at the age of 13 and went to live with her husband, I think, when she was 15. And then her husband shortly thereafter became her disciple and became a great guru in his own right. Through the gaps in the thatched roof, this body could see branches and leaves of a neem and a mango tree. On that morning, an elderly Brahmin of the village came to the house. Grandmother carried this body in her arms and, sitting on bent knees at the door of the room, showed her to him. At that time, the Brahmin gave Ma the name Dakshayani. That means the female creative power of Brahma. This body's head was then positioned toward the east. Looking up, she saw leaves and branches of trees and the sky. So this is an account of someone who was born fully aware of their surroundings as an infant at the time of emergence. I mean, she wasn't really born in the normal sense. It's one thing to hear somebody like me say somebody was an avatar and go, yeah, whatever. But because of Ma living in the 20th century most of her life, we have many, many, many accounts of what is called her Leela, her play. So there are many, thousands and thousands of accounts of the extraordinary siddhis, the extraordinary manifestations that she displayed, especially when she was in her 20s and early 30s. And, you know, there are videos of her extraordinary bhavas, her extraordinary moods that would display to people, of her incarnating Krishna and Shiva and Chinnamasta and Durga. There are many, you know, just accounts from so many different people in so many walks of life, scientists and pundits and other kinds of devotees and work people and nuns and, I mean, anybody and everybody. She was not very well known when she was young, but when she became, you know, in her middle years, she was considered by almost everybody in India to be an avatar and had tens of thousands of people who clamored to see her and just to be around her, not for any reason particularly other than that. You can watch many videos of her on YouTube, and if you're interested in her, I really encourage you to do that, because you can feel her bhava, her presence, on even just watching a film of her. The way that she moved, it just like kind of, you know, otherworldly grace with which she conducted herself, her majesty, even though she was this tiny little person. She just has this feeling of a lioness when you see her. She seems bigger than everyone around her. And then every once in a while you'll see a photo and you realize that she's like so diminutive. It's interesting. You can hear her voice. You can hear her singing. If you know Bengali, you can hear her teachings. She taught mostly in Bengali. But there are also many books, and we have some of them here. You can read good translations of her satsangs. So she had very little schooling. She, by her own account, only attended about a total of 3 months of schooling in her entire life. Maybe 6, I can't remember exactly what it says, but something in that range. And as she said, and she said this throughout her life, that whenever she asked a question in her own mind, the answer would just appear. And she said she had so little schooling, she got good grades because when she was taking tests, it would just be about the one thing she had studied. And if she didn't know something, the answer would just appear in her mind. Because she was a direct emanation of wisdom, there was no separation between her and primordial wisdom. So she had this quality of being able to know things that are usually we're not privy to. For instance, even though she was barely literate, she was incredibly nimble and sophisticated in her use of language. She loved puns and wordplay, and she was often challenged by the pundits and spiritual philosophers of her day, particularly because she was a woman. If you listen to the satsangs and the translations of them and then accounts of certain events, she was often being, sort of tested by people. And she always knew the perfect thing to say. She could quote long passages of philosophical texts and scriptures. She knew all kinds of rituals and mantras without ever having studied them. She could perform rituals and traditions other than the one that she brought up in. For instance, there was a neighbor who was Muslim and needed help performing namaz, which is the death rites, when she was a little girl, and she just went with him and did it for him. With in whatever Arabic, I don't know what language it was in, but knowing all the right gestures and everything. This basically it teaches us that wisdom, that everything is made of wisdom, and that when we become more awake, the fruit of that awakeness is always wisdom. It's always having this direct experience of wisdom, and this is why these traditions are called direct realization traditions. She was married to a man named Bolanath, who, much to his surprise, found himself being a caretaker for a very extraordinary young woman. And he attempted, apparently, to have a normal marriage with her, but failed miserably. And eventually gave up and was initiated by her and became a great sadhu, a great practitioner, and highly realized in his own right. When she was younger, and I don't know exactly what age, in her 20s, I guess, she went through what she called her 7 years of Leela. These were 7 years during which she spontaneously manifested thousands and thousands of different sadhanas in her own body. Mantras, asanas, Kriya Yoga, all kinds of extraordinary things just flowing through her body pretty much night and day. And by her report, she said that this happened so that she would be able to teach us. She said she didn't need these sadhanas for herself. And she also said that sadhanas that would take us, or any one of us, 10,000 years to complete were completed in her body in moments. That she just went through these extraordinary series of realizations about these sadhanas so that she could then pass them to us. This is also fairly common both in the Indian and the Tibetan tradition, that there would be some extraordinary kind of being or a regular human teacher who was highly realized, who would be given a direct transmission of teachings for the purpose of passing them into the human realm. In the Tibetan tradition, these teachers are called tertans, but then even more subtle than the tertans, the human teachers who receive these teachings are the dakinis, the more subtle teachers in the dakini realms who give them to the human tertans. So that, this idea of receiving teachings and receiving texts from more subtle layers of reality is not unique to Ma or unique to the Indian tradition, but she certainly embodied it to a degree that I don't know that anyone else has. So then after this play of sadhana completed, her life became a little more normal, and she began on this tremendous period. I think it lasted 30 years of wandering, mostly in North India, but also in South India. And she would just, head on out with no plan that she had announced to anybody, sometimes dragging people with her who didn't want to go, leaving behind their families with no notice whatsoever. She traveled all over the Himalayas and North India and Central India, and then made a couple of trips to South India also. And during these trips, she just talked to tens of thousands of people. And she said that, first of all, that we only saw her traveling, but she actually wasn't going anywhere. She said, you know, when you walk around your living room, does someone say you're on a trip? So she herself said she didn't have an experience of going anywhere. And she also said that when her devotees complained, they said, Ma, why do you go seeing all these people who really aren't ever going to do much sadhana? They're not good students. Why are you bothering traveling to see them? And she would say, well, even spending a few moments in the presence of this body gives people such peace, and that's why I do it. Mm-hmm. This was really part of her great, great, great compassion. She was, in 1936, reinitiated the practice of giving the Gayatri Mantra publicly to women. So she was a great supporter of women practitioners. And she started schools for girls. They're called the Kanya schools, and they still exist today, where she taught young Indian women Sanskrit and science and sent them off to college. And she also started initiating women into sannyas and also into the Gayatri Mantra, which the Gayatri Mantra had been kind of taken over by the Brahmin class and denied to women or anybody of any other class other than Brahmin boys. And she started that practice up again in public, although I'm sure it was still happening in private. And that practice actually was taken up by my Diksha lineage also, which and it has initiated thousands of women into sannyas and into the Gayatri. At some point, you know, she started having a lot of devotees, and as Indians will, they wanted to build ashrams. And at first she was saying, you know, I don't want ashrams, we don't need ashrams. She said, she herself was a householder. She spent some years cooking and cleaning and taking care of people, and even when she was very well known, and you know, when she was wandering in the Himalayas with just a few people, she would still sometimes cook for people. I mean, she really was not. She was both, as many people have reported, both completely ordinary and completely extraordinary at the same time. And that's where we get to see what it really means to be enlightened. We get to drop all of our holy schmoly ideas, all of our, you know, Walmart ideas about what enlightenment is, and get totally blown away by what it is, and that it includes everything ordinary also. That's a wonderful thing about it. So she told her devotees not to build ashrams, but they just kept insisting, and so she decided she would play their game. And many ashrams were built around India in her name that still exist today, and you can go visit them and see places and hang out in places and do sadhana in places where she taught and where she lived and where she walked around. We have done 2 yatras, or 2 pilgrimages, going to places in India that were places where she was. So at some time early in her coming into her own as a spiritual light, she stopped feeding herself, and she only ate when other people would feed her. This was also part of her Leela. She often said, "Don't call me mother," although everyone did. I am your little girl. And she really embodied the Indian tradition of the students taking care of the teacher in a very intimate physical way, so that you can become familiar with the divine. This familiarity with the divine is very important in Indian spiritual practice. If you go into an Indian temple, no one is like sitting back, staring respectfully at some statue. You know, people are like throwing themselves at the statue, slathering it with stuff, draping it with flowers, kissing it, hugging it, yelling at it, calling out to it, crying, stroking. There's a sense of incredible intimacy with that whatever those deities represent. And in fact, they represent our own enlightened wisdom virtues. So as we become intimate with them, we also become intimate with ourselves. We lose the fear of our own enlightened essence nature. So Ma exemplified this in one sense by having people feed her and treat her as a little child and learn to care for her, and therefore, or thereby also learn to care for themselves and for other people too. So there are some wonderful videos and photos of students feeding her. She also played a lot with her human body. She was really curious about the experience of being in a human body. And so she would go for long periods without eating much, and she would experiment with not breathing, and she would experiment with eating tons of food, and all kinds of wacky things that she did. It drove her disciples nuts because, of course, they were still in ordinary mind, worrying about her. She would get illnesses and would refuse to be treated, and then when they got too worried, they would take her to the doctor, and all of a sudden she'd be fine. So she once said about her eating that she had discovered through all of these experiments that she really didn't need to eat. It wasn't necessary, but that she did it because she didn't want to freak everybody out. The thing that we can take from that is not that we shouldn't eat, but we're not in that condition that she was in, so we would get very sick if we didn't eat. She was very healthy when she didn't eat. She didn't even lose weight, apparently, according to the reports. So the thing that we can take away from it, though, is just a more playful, experimental attitude toward our lives. We are so over-earnest about everything, over-serious about everything, always worrying about ourselves, about how we are. And, you know, if instead of worrying, we were curious, that would be a really wonderful shift for everybody. Here we are, you know, we have these bodies, we have this world to play with. You know, we know very little about it. Most of us know very little about the real capabilities of being a human being. And we have a possibility as spiritual practitioners to play with that and experiment with that and see what happens. She, toward the end of her life, had many, many famous people as her disciples, members of the Gandhi family, you know, highly placed politicians and artists and intellectuals and local kings and poobahs and things like that. And when she died in 1982 at the age of 86, there was literally tens of thousands of people in the street following her body. Was on some sort of palanquin. I don't know exactly what happened. She was, her body was interred in Kankal at the ashram that I was talking about a little bit earlier. And you can go to her, what they call Mahasamadhi. It's a little silly to call it a Mahasamadhi in her case, since she was always in that awake condition. So she didn't have to go anywhere or do anything, including die, to experience that. Her teachings were only delivered in the format of satsang. So if you watch videos of her, especially the ones where she's in a room with other people, you'll see her just kind of relaxing and looking around, and then sometimes, but just to watch her relaxing and looking around is like electrifying. And then you'll see her talking to people, and sometimes she's extremely animated, laughing, and she loved to laugh. Her laugh was really amazing. If you hear it, you can hear it on a tape if you want to. A tape? No. On the internet. They probably were originally tapes. But she did not give teachings unless people asked her questions. So she was embodying that call and response aspect of the world, where you ask something and you get a response, and she was fully embodying that. But she gave many, many thousands and thousands of satsangs, and a good portion of them have been translated into English. The sophistication of her teachings is really breathtaking. They're sophisticated not in a way like, you know, reading some philosophical tome, but they are both very straightforward in ordinary language, speaking to people from all walks of life, at the same time that they managed to convey the absolute most subtle thing you could possibly convey about our experience and reality. She is always talking on many different levels at once. Some of her teachings are hard, or somewhat harder for Westerners to get into, contemporary Westerners, because she is speaking also to a specifically Indian audience at a particular point in history, and she's using words that, you know, we have knee-jerk reactions to, like referring to God as He and that kind of a thing. Some of the translations seem to be slightly, you know, King John's Bible English, but not all of them. There's some other translations that are probably much more like how she actually talked. So I would encourage you that even if sometimes the language is a little bit off-putting, that you read them and give them a chance, because they really are the best teachings that I have ever had. I have had wonderful, wonderful teachers. I also have a PhD and wrote my dissertation in part about this tradition, and so read a lot of, you know, academic books and stuff about the tradition. And I have just never encountered teachings about reality and about the process of waking up that are so thorough, so nuanced, so clear, and that keep producing it. Like every time you read them over time, they just keep producing more and more wisdom and striking you in different ways, you know, as you go along. So, you know, whatever you might feel about the language at certain points, they're really worth reading. She had, you know, certain teachings that she repeated in different ways over and over again. And I'm just going to summarize what her core teachings were. First of all, that self-realization is nothing more or less than knowing yourself. She said, realize and know yourself. And when she said know yourself, she didn't mean that in a psychological way. She didn't mean know this little self, although that's included. She meant know the self, know yourself to be all of reality, so that you realize and you know who and what you really are. And that is the definition of self-realization. She taught that you are God, that reality, she just called it that. She often referred to all of reality as that. And she would say, you are that. And that is both limited and unlimited. So that is unlimited, but it produces experiences of limitation. So her way of teaching was not transcendental. In other words, she wasn't teaching that you have to get rid of this world, that it's unreal, that you have to go somewhere else up on a mountain. She was teaching that all of reality, enlightened reality, is here, and it's knowable by us, by doing sadhana. She taught that there are infinite stages to spiritual practice, that they get more and more subtle, and that there are infinite paths to waking up that are all created by the same consciousness and energy, and that every path, even no matter how dumb it looks to us, is good for the people that need it. So she was incredibly respectful and generous, although that doesn't really explain how she was, because she was those paths also. But in our relative terms, we could say that she was incredibly respectful and generous of everybody's path. And what she taught was that even if you're on a very limited path, because you have limitations and that's the path that appeals to you in that moment, that if you complete that path with sincerity, you go through it to the end, that inevitably, she said, a new path, a wider path would open up. And she said, this is the way that we move toward awakening. She described that process through perhaps many, many lifetimes of encountering more and more expansive paths as we go along, as a process of a horse and a cart going to meet a train. And she said, you know, if you encounter a train, get on the train, but don't disparage the horse and cart, because it got you to the train. And that was one of the metaphors that she used. She also taught a message of discovery, which he's called finding out. So rather than encouraging belief, she didn't really encourage people to believe in things. She didn't, as far as I know, come right out and speak against belief, which many of my teachers have. But she did always say, you have to find out for yourself. This is what this is about. She encouraged people receiving teachings from her to find out for themselves if what she was saying was correct. That each person has to discover in a real way who they are, that we're not just here to believe and have faith in things, that we should find out about them for real. That is actually the fruit of real enlightenment, is that you actually know. You're not just believing in something. So the paths that encourage belief, I'm sure she would say, are fine for those people that need to believe in something. But then you can eventually be on a path where you don't need to believe in anything. You can actually just find out. You're given the tools to really discover for yourself.